technology itself alone isn't enough, right? The design and design intent also matters.
Hi, I'm Joanne,
Hi, I'm Shashank.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Uthara. Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast. It's really nice to have you join us. Maybe a good place to start is to have you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about the work you do at Snap, and of course, other areas that you're interested in that relate to your work.
Joanne, Shashank, thanks so much for having me. My name is Uthara, and I head the public policy team for Snapchat in India and South Asia. As you guys might know, about 80% of Snapchat's 250 million users in India are between the ages of 13 and 24. And in a sense, we have become a bit of a Gen Z platform. And because of this, a big part of my work in the last 3 years at Snapchat really sits at this fascinating intersection between technology policy and then under 18 user safety, right? And what we do as a policy team is to advise governments on legislation. And in doing that, we try to think about legislation that protects young users, of course, but also preserving what makes social media valuable to them as a general rule, right? I think that in doing that, what I have found myself particularly drawn to in the last few years is questions around privacy and safety by design. And to me, there's this abiding question under that, which is about how do we build platforms that are engaging and responsible, right? I have to admit, this is very much informed by Snap's design philosophy and the types of discussions we've been exposed to internally a lot within the company. Before Snapchat, I spent some time at Amazon's policy team, and before that at the office of Rajiv Chandrasekhar before he became a minister when he was an independent MP. In this past decade and more, as both of you know very well, a lot has happened in India and South Asia tech policy wise. I think the growth in internet penetration and smartphone adoption combined with the pandemic has caused this type of natural acceleration in tech policy making, right? And candidly, I'm just happy to be here and contribute in small ways to the conversations to the organizations I've represented. Yeah.
Thanks, Uthara. That was great insight into the work that you're doing and even the issues that you're focusing on. I think it really helps set the context for why we wanted to chat with you today. To focus the conversation around the online experiences of young people on social media platforms. And given that Snap is primarily used by young people, like you said, um, based on this user base that you're working with, we'd really like to hear from you about some of the challenges around the safety and the security of young people you see online, especially on social media.
Thanks, Joanne. There is, a number of different concerns that impact young people's user safety at the moment, right? But I want to talk about two things, specifically content discovery and social dynamics. And a sort of uber point I want to make while talking about both these issues is the fact that we believe at Snap that platform design fundamentally shapes user safety, right? So let's talk about, for instance, content discovery. Lots of platforms, for instance, are built around recommendation algorithms, right? And many researchers, as I'm sure you both know, have referred to recommendation algorithms creating this sort of rabbit hole effect, right? So you start watching, for instance, dance videos, and gradually over time, the algorithm pushes you towards more extreme content about, for instance, like body image or harms or dangerous challenges, right? So that's the type of thing we've seen on content discovery. In my opinion, this isn't a bug, right? I think it's often a core feature of algorithms to maximize engagement. And again, here at Snapchat, right, the design ethos is quite distinct. We've taken a fundamentally different approach here, right? So our platform is built around conversations one on one with close friends, not so much discovering content put out by strangers, right? And so, because of that, what's happening is that when young people use Snapchat in India, they're typically messaging friends from their real life, right? and they're not necessarily building a public persona or chasing viral fame, right? The second sort of thing I want to talk about was, as I mentioned earlier, social dynamics, right? There's been a lot of research in the last few years, and the company is super alive to this, which shows that public metrics like follow accounts or likes, essentially, right? They create this pretty intense social comparison pressure, and this is especially bad for developing minds, right? People between the ages of 13 and 18. So again, over here we've done something pretty intentional, right? On Snapchat, there are no vanity metrics. So you don't have public likes, you don't have follower numbers. And because of this, the environment the app creates is there is a very clear focus on just communicating one on one with your friends, right? I feel like these design choices are very crucial, especially in a market like India, right? Where a lot of young users are using social media for the very first time, right? And the way the platform is designed has a fundamental impact and basically shapes their entire online experience in a sense. And look, I'm not saying Snapchat is perfect. No platform is perfect. And absolutely, there are risks that exist even in the private messaging space, right? So, harms like bullying and harassment, for instance, are very prevalent in a one on one chat environment. But even so, I think that being intentional about design from the start is perhaps much more effective than relying solely on like a content takedown or content moderation regime after the fact, right? So, in a sense, if I were to put it in one line, I feel like the way that a lot of people at Snapchat talk about this is that sometimes the best safety feature isn't like a visible, conspicuous safety. Look at me, I'm enabling safety kind of feature. It's really about what you choose not to build in a sense that matters more. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's really how we've thought about design.
Uttara, if I may jump in, that's very useful to know that, and that's very intuitive that not all platforms are the same, and the platform design really defines your experience, and then the kind of harms or challenges that you face as a user. That's really useful. I'm wondering that even platforms like Snap and other platforms that do not rely on a very public social media kind of feed, typically with platforms that have a live public feed, you still do rely on discoverability and connections with friends, right? So I'm wondering if there are challenges that you notice with the discoverability of friends, and sort of making friends with strangers, etc. And how do you at Snap sort of tackle those kind of issues?
So specifically, Shashank, on I think for me the abiding design philosophy over here is the fact that on Snapchat, and we did this after a lot of feedback from our users in the first few years, right? Is that we have to be able to limit strangers from contacting under 18s, right? So in the last 1 year, we actually did introduce new design protections that, in a sense, track who an under 18 user is based on their self disclosure, of course, and based on threat indicators that we have on the platform, right? So, for instance, if there is a much older user in a very different location, in a very far away location, trying to establish contact with an under 18 user, or if that particular user has a number of trust and safety escalations against them, we prevent that friend request from even being delivered, right? So that's one strong way in which we prevent stranger contact. The second thing that we do from a design perspective again is that you don't have a public friend group, right? We basically ensure that public, like your friend group on Snapchat is completely private. This is regardless of the fact of you being under 18 or not. And this in turn also helps preventing from bad actors contacting teenagers. Look, I'll say another thing, right? I feel like we have to acknowledge the fact that there is a bit of an arms race dynamic when it comes to the threat landscape for under 18s and the design response of platforms. Okay, so in a sense, I don't think it's a one and done. I think what we tend to do is constantly evaluate what has changed and whether our current design decisions continue to protect young people, especially users between the ages of 13 and 18. And we continue to every year actually make new introductions of features that try to minimize these harms. So that's really been our approach so far.
No, that's great, and that neatly fits into what I was about to ask you after was, uh, what are some of the key mechanisms that, of course, you all are utilizing at Snap, but that you see around in the ecosystem that are useful interventions to ensure trust and safety, and especially when it comes to safety of young people. So, if there's anything additional you want to add, I know that Snap specifically has really centered safety around family center, a feature. So if you'd want to talk about that and other solutions, either from research or from peer platforms that you see, happy to open that space up to you for a deep dive.
Yeah, look, I'll say a couple of things here, Shashank. First, yes, we absolutely used advanced technology to protect users. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, we have AI systems detecting potential threats. I just talked about that, right? So, are there bad actors, and what are signals for them, and how do we ensure that they limit contact with under 18s? Number two, in some instances, we use age estimation technology to verify if users are in fact the age they claim to be, right? And three, for instance, we use automated systems for monitoring signs of harassment, right? So these are the three types of technologies we do use. And I should add, these are not optional extras, right? They are very much essential tools for the safety infrastructure of the platform. But that being said, Shashank, I think we tend to take a bit of a portfolio approach to safety at Snapchat. And I think coming from this is an explicit acknowledgement that the technology itself alone isn't enough, right? The design and design intent also matters. Okay. So beyond Family Center, which by the way is an add-on, there are other very fundamental, subtle design features that actively reduce certain risks, and they have been introduced for that purpose. The first of these, as you know, is ephemerality. Ephemerality is inherently privacy protecting. Second, as I already mentioned earlier, is the absence of vanity metrics. Like you don't have likes, you don't have uh, any friend groups or friend count that is competitive. Uh, Third, you don't have an algorithmic feed that's pushing content onto the user. Fourth, there is an absence of viral sharing on the platform. And five, as I mentioned already, is an intentional set of features that reduce stranger contact for under 18s, right? Uh, but I feel like, as I already mentioned, right, there is a bit of an arms race dynamic between threats and what we do as a platform. We are navigating a bunch of complexity, and I think we're constantly asking ourselves if our safety features are keeping pace with this evolving threat landscape. Uh, and I think beyond all of this as well, right, with every single new feature, there's also the question about, is there a trade-off between safety and privacy and protection and autonomy? So I think that some of these trade-offs are what platforms are continually contending while um, approaching safety from a design and programmatic perspective.
Awesome. And when I used to use Snap, I used to love the temporary sort of ephemerality that you're talking about of pictures exchanging. So that was very interesting, and not a lot of services existed at that time that offered that feature. Just if for our listeners, Uttara, if you can maybe for a few seconds talk about what Family Center is and what it offers, because I feel it's a very unique proposition. If you want to do that, and then on to Joanne.
So within Snapchat, we have Family Center, and really it's meant to be a feature that helps parents get more insight into who their teens are interacting with on Snapchat, while striking this balance between, actually being privy to the contents of their conversation, right? So in a way, we've tried to emulate a design centric, like a real world feeling to the way Family Center was designed. So in a normal case, parents often know who their children's friends are and who they're interacting with, but they may not necessarily be privy to every single conversation. So that's how Family Center's design as well allows a parent to see who their teenager is speaking with and who they have spoken to in the last several days without necessarily sharing the contents of the conversation. Uh, it's a good example of us trying to balance this uh, trade off between oversight and control. We think that we struck the right balance here by allowing parents to see how their teenager is doing on Snapchat without overly breaching teen privacy either. So that's one powerful way that I think that Snap allows parents some modicum of oversight into their teenagers' online behavior.
Thanks, Uttara. I think that ties in quite nicely with what I was hoping to ask. Um, Quite related to what you mentioned about how you're trying to balance what young users and how they're using the platform, but also that kind of oversight that is necessary for their safety, including bringing parents in. And more broadly, I know the platforms tend to have to respond to concerns, to address some of these concerns more that are more rapidly developing. And in trying to achieve that, I'm sure that there are challenges that platforms have to face. Like one thing, creating this sort of like balance between young people's autonomy and then these safety measures. I was wondering if there are maybe other kinds of challenges that generally platforms, even that you're seeing at Snap, that kind of come crop up with trying to address some of these harms.
For sure, right? I think there's two examples that I can cite, Joanne. The first is parental consent, and the second is encryption. I'll talk about parental consent first because it's such a live problem that we're contending with. And I also think that the debate on parental consent perfectly captures some of these tensions, right? So, ostensibly, a parental consent requirement is a clear safety measure, right? It sort of necessitates, it sort of assumes that parents giving consent over a child's use of a particular app makes them safer, right? Um, but from a product perspective, I think what it requires platforms to do is examine a number of trade-offs, right? And what are these trade-offs? Number one is young people's agency and access, which is especially critical in a country like India, where digital literacy is typically lower, especially in more remote parts of the country. Number two, there is an obvious data maximization and adjacent privacy risks associated with collecting the PII of every single parent and every single child, right? Number three is ensuring that whatever mechanism you use to collect parental consent or verifiable parental consent is technically accurate, right? That's also a hard one. And the fourth, which is perhaps the least important of all, but also crucial for other companies with fewer resources, for instance, is cost, right? Um, and I think having like sort of talked about this from different perspectives internally with many different people, both at Snap and outside the last few years, I think we bottomed out on the fact is that as of today, there is no option for verification available that optimizes for all of these factors that I just outlined, right? And in a sense, what companies then are forced to do, especially, and we'll of course see what the law says, is we're forced to make a significant trade off no matter what the solution, right? So you're going to compromise on one or the other four factors that I had outlined. And I feel like encryption is a similarly complex issue that presents trade offs, right? So, obviously, encryption is crucial for protecting users, young users, especially for harms such as like cyber stalking and identity theft. And they are both also increasing for young people, especially in the last many years. But the same encryption technology that keeps bad actors out can also limit the ability of platforms to detect harmful content, right? So, for instance, certain types of photo DNA and CSAM detection technologies cannot work very optimally in a highly encrypted environment, right? So, all of this to say, right, I think what happens sometimes is that platforms are often in situations where we're balancing between competing goods rather than choosing between clear right and wrong answers, right? Yeah, so I think these two issues to me have sort of been clear examples where the trade-offs have been complex for us to navigate. And to be honest, I feel like this is the reason why we need to carefully consider both intended and unintended consequences of policy before they actually come to pass.
Thanks, Sutra. That's great because even at CCG and me and other colleagues have written about this, that we care a lot about also centering the conversation around safety of young people, around their autonomy, around their self-expression. Because especially in India with the social dynamics, a lot of times families are very protectionist about children's experiences, and the internet and services like Snap and other social media services actually give them a lot of opportunity for self-expression and self-development. And we feel very strongly that that should also be considered when we think about policies for their protection. And you already touched upon this tricky balance, or the sort of trying to strike a balance between regulation on one side and that user experience on one side. And I was about to bring up India's data protection law, right? That hopefully soon will be in effect. That kind of we're still thinking about it, but kind of wants to ask for parental consent for all under 18s, right? And how is Snap thinking about that situation, especially as as you said, your user base is so young. I have a follow up, but I'll let you respond here, and then I'll come back to you.
Oh gosh, Shashank, I feel like this whole thing about Section 9 and verifiable parental consent has been the number one issue that our team has spent a lot of time working through in the last 2 years, right? Um, I think on our part, what we've tried to do in our discussions with government is be very open and explicit about the complexities involved with doing this in a way that is accurate, privacy protecting, and balancing the young people, the agency and oversight of young people, right? There's a lot of complexity in the issue. We sort of just talked about it as well, right? But I think at the heart of it is the assumption that parental consent, in and of itself, is going to have a powerful effect or be a silver bullet for under 18 safety on the internet in India, right? I think what we've had to do in our discussions is basically highlight the fact that safety, especially of young people on the internet, is a complex issue. It requires a separate, considered approach. Perhaps it even requires a separate discussion for the need for regulation that is specialized on young people, as opposed to treating it within the ambit of just the data protection law with two sections, right? So, to be honest, we'll see what happens with the rules, but our endeavor has been to highlight the complexity and bat for implementation that is feasible and that does not make any bad trade-offs between, you know, data maximization and privacy, autonomy of young people, and technical feasibility, right? And for what it's worth, I do think that METI, for one, has understood how complex this proposition is. And we'll see what the rules say. They've been pending for several months now. But I think that once the rules are out, we know what the actual statutory requirement that is placed on companies will be at the time.
Great. That's very useful, Uttara. And I also want to get your thoughts on what is famously called COSA, which is the Kids Online Safety Act in the US. For our listeners, it's like an omnibus legislation that the US Congress is considering, especially focusing on the safety of young people online. And it has, various prescriptive measures for various companies to and services to take up. It has had a mixed response. There has been critique on it as well as support. But Uttara, I'd love to get your response. And also, in your opinion, in your experience, is there a way to have balanced regulation? Because it's fair for it at some level, it's fair for policymakers to be like, hey, there's too much going on and we need to have protectionist measures to start responding to some of these issues.
Yeah. So, Shashank, Joanne, Snap was actually the first major platform in the US to publicly support the Kids Online Safety Act. Okay. And why is this? It's because the COSA's core provisions align quite closely, actually, with the protections we've already built into the Snapchat product, right? What are these? There is a strict teen account contact settings by default. So, the thing I said earlier about making sure that the contact book of teenagers is private by default. Uh, we provide additional privacy features and safety features for young users. We offer an in-app parental control mechanism and in-app reporting tools. And we also, from the beginning, have limited the amount of personal data we're collecting, and we've limited the time under which we're storing it, right? So these fundamental principles that have informed the design of COSA are already sort of reflected in how Snapchat is built. So it sort of felt like a natural extension almost of the product, and it felt like a good way to indicate our commitment to under 18 online safety, right? Um, that said, I think, as we start thinking about broader regulations, particularly around parental consent, we will have to consider carefully implementation, the challenges there, and the unintended consequences in terms of access, like you correctly said earlier, Shashank. Um, I think I already said this, but I feel like in India, we might be considering safety only in the context of two laws, right? We're considering Section 9 of the DPDPA, which is like 5 sentences, and then also, the POXO Act, right? Where there is some uh, implications in terms of online sexual content, etc., online CSAM, etc., right? Um, I do think that we need to take a little bit more of a broader approach towards regulation. And I'll say this, right? I don't think that regulators are misplaced in providing or batting for a more onerous set of regulations for children's online safety. I think the issue, though, is that when we talk about creating regulation, it needs to be good faith, it needs to be apolitical, and it needs to sort of rationally frame the problem statement, right? I think if we could all get together to create some type of framework that is proportionate, risk based, that frankly takes a very cold, hard look at the harm landscape and creates you know, even more obligations on platforms, but not in a way that restricts access, internet access and all the benefits of the internet to young users, we might be able to do that, right? I think that COSA and AADC try to do that in their own markets, but we need to see what an Indian version of that might look like, keeping in mind our unique, market dynamics and conditions.
Thanks, Uttara. I think we've talked about a lot of different perspectives that have come from insights with, say, regulation outside of India, things that are being considered even for regulation within the data protection law in India. And I know that you zoomed out a little bit, so I want to take it a little bit more further and think of it in terms of the year coming to an end and us moving into 2025 soon. And I just wanted to ask if there are some things that you hope to see next year towards making social media spaces and the general online experience of young users safer. I know you've mentioned a few things about privacy by default and even the in-app parental mechanism that Snaps incorporated within their design and their policy. But even in the larger space, keeping in mind the best interests of children and what you think you'd like to see that comes into discourse also over the next year.
Wow. Okay. I'd say the first thing, Joanne, is that I hope that we get the DPDP Section 9 piece right as a country. I think it's important for us to be measured and thoughtful in the way that we think about parental consent and the restrictions on behavioral monitoring and targeting. I do think that the current framing of those sections is a bit over wide and perhaps unfeasible. And I know that Meti understands some of these challenges, and I hope that the rules reflect the fact that these are, high impact propositions. That's number one. Number two, I think that having taken a measured approach to DPDP, I do think it's also time for platforms, the government, civil society, and other actors to come together to have a very measured and thoughtful discussion about um, online safety of under 18s, right? I do think that unfortunately in India, we sometimes tend to conflate content regulation discussions with online safety, or we sort of sometimes actually even more dangerously try to conflate liability. So, for instance, safe harbor protections with more accountability for platforms. I think that because there's been so much pressure in many parts of the world about, hey, do we even still need safe harbor anymore? In order to sort of, yes, I mean, short answer, obviously all of us need safe harbor. Safe harbor is underpins the internet and should always exist. But I think in order for that framing to go away, it's up to platforms to, in good faith, say, hey, the threat landscape has indeed changed. What can we do to have a genuine and honest discussion about keeping vulnerable users of the internet safer, uh, and maybe define approaches toward doing that, right? And I do think that safety by design could potentially be a good regulatory incentive kind of mechanism to create an environment where all corporates feel incentivized to do right by the types of products they're putting out there. But yeah, I just feel like perhaps reality will be a little bit different because under 18 safety discussions and online safety discussions invariably become political, right? So, and that unfortunately does harm the discourse and the end product more than it benefits it. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Jan, do you want to go?
I mean, I think that what you said about some of this conversation becoming political and also it being sort of ad hoc and responsive based off of the conversations that are happening in the ecosystem, in the space, is really what will kind of keep us on our feet. I mean, what we'd like to have is definitely very different from what might always transpire. But it's always good to have some of these ideas of what we'd like to see so that we know that we have something that we're working towards. And also, especially with the intention of collectively having some of those goals, right? Because with that kind of support across different kinds of platforms, across different kinds of stakeholders, then you are working towards, I would say, a sort of collective goal. I think it's kind of
Mhm.
in numbers sort of
Yeah.
approach. But Shashank, please, if you had something to say, please come in.
No, I think Uttara, you've been pointing to something that we believe in at CCG, which is multi-stakeholder um, models of engagement and policy making. I know there's a criticism on that forum because power dynamics are not equal, but I believe and we believe that where tech policy has come to in India is that we're all talking in corners and we're not talking to each other. For example, as you rightly pointed out, and Joanne was saying that the online safety of young people is a joint and shared goal for civil society, for the government, and for services, right? I think what's happening right now is where government is coming out with draft rules, let's say, without meaningfully engaging with the two of us and understanding that the goals remain the same.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear you out, and this conversation is an effort on our side
Mm.
to break those barriers, to have conversations with each other,
Yeah.
and get ideas from each other as well, right? As we respond to some of these questions that are very hard to solve for, and we may not have a solution tomorrow, but we can't solve for these unless we talk to each other. But at Snap, and as a policy professional yourself, Uttara, what is your opinion on talking to each other, multi-stakeholder approach, bringing that back to conversations, especially in India on tech policy?
Candidly, Shashank, I feel like it's obvious, and multi-stakeholder policy making just lends more legitimacy to a policy outcome. In if when there's been enough discussion and debate, and multiple perspectives have been processed by the government machinery before something actually becomes law, right? So yeah, absolutely, we need to have more multi-stakeholder driven policies. Do they happen at the moment in the way that they should? They don't, right? It's also obvious. What is the solution? I don't know. But I remember for several years now, a number of us at various panels have discussed the need for a pre legislative consultation policy. I know something existed in the government stables. The DOPT had a policy of this nature some years ago, but it's, of course, not a legislation that mandates it, right? So yeah, I think that if there was a way for all of us to get together to bat for more consultation and a standard process of consultation across all governments, across all government departments, that might be a useful way for us to ensure there's more natural consultation. Number one, but beyond that as well, I think there are other ways for us to collaborate. For instance, I actually find that in India, there's this funny situation where civil society and tech companies typically have the same perspective on most issues, and are often allies. I think I can think of data localization as an example, encryption, content regulation, intermediary liability. They're pretty much at the
Yeah,
same,
safe harbor as well. Yeah,
we're on the
yeah,
same page, right? And I
yeah,
have often
yeah.
found that, in fact, uh, like when we draft submissions or we're making points to the government, we try to take as holistic a perspective while making those arguments. And it's often quite, by the way, derived from the work of people like yourselves, right? Like all of the papers and work that you do, we do indeed read them and ensure that some of that is reflected and cited into the submissions that we make as Snap anyway. So yeah, look, I don't know. I think this is a very complex problem statement, but more good faith conversations and more engagement between ourselves could be helpful too. Although I will say, I think in Delhi, it's a bit of an insular policy ecosystem. We do in fact talk quite openly to each other, in my opinion.
No, we agree with you, Uttara, and we are trying to, as best as we can, of course, as civil society, as part of academia and civil society, request the government to open up channels for multi-stakeholder conversation. I would say, to the government's benefit, they have tried in the past. Especially in the last year or 2 years, there have been at least rooms and spaces created
Hmm.
for all of us to come together, and I wish that that continues. But at an individual level as well, in for example, this conversation is an effort to talk to industry, and I would ask you, um, as well, that if you can request other colleagues from other services also, if they happen to be comfortable talking to us even off the record, right, that would be great for us to exchange
Yeah.
notes. So yeah, we're trying to create spaces where we invite people from industry to share the limitations, like you shared, right, that there are some great ideas but they're not feasible when it comes to implementing them for the product. I think unless we come up with solutions that are implementable, we won't be able to fast track the trust and safety conversation that we've been having around the world. So thanks so much, Uttara, for doing this. I
Yes.
think we really greatly appreciate it, and it's our joint goal towards a more holistic and involved conversation.
Thanks so much, Uthra. This has been a great conversation.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.